Our first question comes from Jamie P, and they ask, "What should I focus on when immersing?" So they're learning Polish. And now I'm going to read it in first person. I find if I am focused on understanding what I read or listen, I can pretty much ignore what's going on with the word endings of adjectives and nouns, yada yada, and how they indicate to who was doing what to whom, etc. I don't naturally think about what gender nouns are, that sort of thing. I understand that Czech has similar grammar patterns to Polish in cases indicated by forms, da da da. And I wonder how Ben, me, is approaching this. Has he studied the language previously? Has he studied a language previously that has noun, genders, and cases? To what extent is he directing his attention to the word endings beyond what might be required to understand what is being said? Are you expecting at some future point that you will start paying attention more naturally to word endings? Is focusing solely on understanding the most efficient way to get to eventually being able to produce these word endings automatically? Or does it make sense to somehow perhaps encourage ourselves to pay more attention to grammar or word endings right from the beginning of immersing? They put in more about the question, but I think that's the gist of it.
Cool. Well, it seems like the question's for you, so I'll give you a chance to answer first.
Sure. So first, how I'm approaching it is really hands-off. I've talked about this briefly in my videos. But from basically everything that I've come across and seen, it is not required for understanding to really understand the grammar. It's nice to have a general idea to understand that when these two things changes, it doesn't matter. But when this changes, it does matter a lot. But that is just like the bare minimum. I actually had to do no study in Czech for this because it uses verbs a lot like Spanish does, which I've studied, and it uses cases like German does, which I've also studied in the past. And so I'm familiar with these concepts, and so I've never actually had to learn that, oh, the ending changes on a noun, which changes how it functions with the other nouns in the sentence, because just that base knowledge is enough for understanding, like he mentioned. I'm not focusing on endings pretty much at all unless it is useful for understanding. Like when verbs end in a different thing, it tells you who's doing the verb. And so I'm seeing that, I'm noticing that, but I'm not really focusing on it. I'm not really trying to specifically pick that up, like process the information and then use it. I'm trying to do it a lot more naturally. This means that I am probably wrong more often than I would be if I was really specifically focusing on them, but that's not my goal. And I'm usually right. And if I'm not right, then it's pretty clear through context, or I can just move on because it's one sentence among millions that I'm going to end up immersing in. That being said, once you get to a point where you want to use the language, you do have to learn a bit more about the cases and how it works, because even native speakers don't necessarily always get these things right, because there are some cases in which cases don't really necessarily make logical sense or native sense, or there's just a correct way to put it. Like there's set phrases, or there's things that are like, oh, actually you can't use this case here just because we don't do that. That might be natural. Otherwise, there's all these different little things that are helpful to learn, but you can do that when you're outputting, because to understand, you don't need any of that. And it's a lot easier to learn them when you already understand them. And so it's this, it's a lot easier to start with that understanding and then learn the more specific rules later, because you have actually something to understand and attach to that rule, rather than just being taught that you use a subjunctive to do this thing. It's like, okay, but I don't know what the subjunctive is. I don't understand. I don't know why it's there. But later on, it's a lot easier to go, oh, got it. Yeah, I've seen that a ton of times. I understand it now. Like, it's just a quick explanation that you get in your high school English class when they talk about capitalizing proper nouns. You're like, oh yeah, I've seen that all over the place. I get it. Like that's how I sort of see it. Do you want to add into this grammar study?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's sort of like the broader question of like what should I focus on versus grammar in particular. I totally agree with you that grammar is just much easier to understand when you already understand. Um, when you can read a rule of grammar and be like, oh, I actually already have all of the examples of that in my head to relate it to. I do think there is some value to studying grammar a little earlier on, just so that you can start to pick up on those things. So like with subjunctive, there are I don't know, like 10 super common phrases that trigger the subjunctive. And if you just study those and learn to look for them, you'll just see them all the time. You don't really need to like study, practice them. It's just knowing that they exist will help you to see them in the wild. And the more you see them in the wild, the more they'll stick with you, and the more that you'll acquire them. So I do think that there is value in grammar study for noticing those kind of things. And then, as Ben mentioned, when you actually try to speak, that's where grammar study becomes the most useful, because that's when you're actually being tested against those rules.
Speak and write.
Speak and write, yes. Yeah. Writing in particular is actually quite good. There's a lot of great like spelling and grammar checkers, so you can almost immediately see if you're doing it right or not. And that can actually really help you with the immediate feedback loop to train you on those things. Studying grammar on day one is really not particularly useful in my mind, outside of trying to recognize words. Like when words are modified for specific inflections, that can make it really hard to notice that those words exist. And so that's why we promote the grammar primer, which sort of just gives you a sense of here is how things get modified in the language, so you can start to draw connections back to its root form.
Exactly.
In terms of what to focus on in general, it's not something that you like always focus on the same thing at the same time. Languages are enormous, and there are literally tens of thousands of things that you can focus on. And one of the processes that sort of every student has to get used to is it's not enough just to like sit down and do. You actually have to think about like, what do I want to focus on? Where is my weak spot, and how do I address that? So we've mentioned subjunctive before. I had a weakness with subjunctive. I couldn't really recognize it. And so I just went through and like just read a bunch about different subjunctive examples. I do not particularly find the explanations very useful. This whole idea of like, oh, you know, hypothetical or, you know, wishes and expressions, like that did not resonate with me at all, because there's other ways to express hypotheticals that are not subjunctive. But if I just looked at the forms, the common forms of subjunctive, and I studied the conjugations of subjunctive, then I could go into my immersion and just see them. And every time I see it, I'm like, oh, mental note, that's what it is. And eventually it just becomes pretty natural. And now I like don't even, like if you asked me those 10 things that I studied off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you, but like I can use them in a sentence.
Yeah, it's in some ways it's similar to learning a really like word that specifically refers to like an emotion or something like that, where you can't necessarily define the word, but you do know what it means. It's like, okay, yeah, you use it doesn't work there. That sounds weird, but it sounds good there, there, and there. It's the same sort of thing where you go, yeah, I understand the slightly different version of saying this versus this, but I can't exactly describe it, because a lot of these things are very difficult to describe. There's a reason that like official like linguistic grammars are very, very thick books, because they're trying to be more scientific about it, about a thing that is inherently difficult or possibly impossible to describe fully.
There's there's this channel on YouTube that I really like. It's this redheaded girl, like Latin mom, so she speaks Spanish, but like she's born and raised American. I'm sure you've seen her around, but she has this great video where she's like comes home and asks her mom for help with her Spanish homework. And she's role playing both roles, but she's like, "Why does it trigger the subjunctive here?" And her mom's like, "Because it sounds better." And it's like, no, there's like a reason. Like, why does it do it here? It's like, okay, the reason is because it sounds better.
Specifically in Spanish, my favorite one about that is that lelo doesn't exist, even though grammatically it should. It just switches to celo because that sounds better.
Yep.
And then because that sounds better, often speakers in se can be plural, but native speakers will put the plural on the wrong thing, because it's like, okay, it feels like it should still have a plural anyways. And so even though it should be like leslo, they end up saying celos, which is just because it sounds better. And it's like, all right, I'm in. It sounds better.
Yep.